In 1976, a German billionaire named Theo Albrecht was kidnapped from a parking lot in Essen and held for 17 days. He was so frugal that, after his release, he reportedly tried to claim the ransom payment as a tax-deductible business expense. 3 decades later, the company he co-founded would quietly open its first Australian store in Marrickville, Sydney, on the 25th of January 2001. Almost no one in Australian retail took it seriously. Coles and Woolworths controlled around 80% of the grocery market, had spent the previous 20 years turning that duopoly into one of the most concentrated supermarket sectors on Earth. Yet by 2024, this same little German chain, run on the kidnapped victims' pathological obsession with cost, would be moving more than $13 billion in Australian groceries a year, operating roughly 570 stores, and quietly forcing both incumbents to rebuild their entire pricing strategy around it. The strangest part isn't that Aldi succeeded. It's that the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, in a 2020 report most shoppers have never read, concluded that Aldi's mere presence in a suburb measurably lowered prices at the Coles and Woolworths down the road, sometimes by double-digit percentages on items Aldi didn't even sell. To understand how that's possible, you have to understand a business model that looks, on the surface, almost stupidly simple, and underneath is one of the most ruthlessly engineered supply chains in the Southern Hemisphere. Start with the store itself, walk into an Aldi in Brunswick or Cannington or Wollongong, and the first thing you notice is what isn't there. There are no deli counters, no in-store bakeries pumping out theatrical bread smells, no floral department, no magazine rack engineered to catch your eye while you queue. A typical Coles or Woolworths carries around 20,000 to 25,000 individual product lines. The average Aldi store carries around 1,800. That is not a typo. It is roughly 7% of the range in a store, about 1/3 of the size, generating on a per square meter basis. Sales productivity that internal industry estimates have placed at nearly double the Australian supermarket average. The trick is that most of those 1,800 items are not brands you would recognize. They are Aldi's own private labels, manufactured under contract by suppliers who often also make the branded equivalent sitting on Coles, Woolworths shelves at twice the price. Roughly 90% of what Aldi sells in Australia is private label. At the big two, that figure historically hovered closer to 20%, and even after years of catching up, sits well below half. The result is a store that looks cheap and feels cheap, but is in fact running one of the highest margin private label operations in Australian retail history. The catch, and this is the part most people miss, is that the cheapness is not the strategy. The cheapness is the byproduct. To see the actual strategy, you have to go back to Marrickville in January 2001, and then to the second store in Bankstown, and then to the wave of openings across Western Sydney, the Hunter, and the Illawarra throughout 2002 and 2003. Aldi did not enter Australia the way most foreign retailers do, with a glossy flagship in the central business district. It entered through the outer suburbs in postcodes where median household income was. According to Australian Bureau of Statistics, census data from 2001 and 2006, between 15% and 30% below the metropolitan average, these were areas Coles and Woolworths had treated as captive markets for decades, because there was nowhere else to go. The nearest independent grocers association, the IGA, was a convenience-priced afterthought. Aldi walked in, undercut the branded staples by an average of around 25% according to early choice basket surveys, and watched the foot traffic rearrange itself. By 2010, the chain had crossed 200 stores. By 2016, it crossed 400. And here's where the numbers start to get genuinely strange. In 2016, Roy Morgan Research found that Aldi had overtaken Coles to become the supermarket Australians rated highest on value for money, despite having roughly 1/10 the store count. A UBS analyst note from the same period estimated that every new Aldi opening in a catchment area reduced the sales of the nearest Woolworths by between 5%, 10% in the first 12 months. That is not the behavior of a niche discounter. That is the behavior of a wrecking ball wearing a polo shirt. The mechanism behind the wrecking ball is something supply chain economists call hard discounting, and Australia had simply never seen it done properly before. A hard discounter does not negotiate prices with suppliers. in the traditional sense. It walks into a factory in regional Victoria or the Hunter Valley, looks at the production line, and says, "We will buy your entire output for the next 3 years, on the condition that you produce a single specification of pasta sauce in a single jar size with our label on it, and you do not deviate." The supplier loses pricing power but gains volume certainty so extreme that financing the factory becomes cheaper. Raw materials can be bought in bulk 12 months in advance, and labor can be scheduled with industrial precision. The savings are split asymmetrically between Aldi and the customer, with the supplier taking a thinner but more predictable margin. Multiply that across 1,800 stock keeping units, SKUs, and you have a business that does not need to run weekly specials because the everyday price is already below the competitor's sale price. A 2019 working paper from researchers at the UNSW Business School examining grocery price dispersion across Sydney postcodes found that the standard deviation of prices for comparable staples was significantly lower in suburbs with an Aldi present. The average shelf price at nearby Coles and Woolworths stores was, controlling for demographics, between 3% and 7% lower than at equivalent stores without an Aldi within a 5-kilometer radius. The Aldi effect, the authors called it. It was not a marketing slogan, it was a measurable distortion in the local price field, but pricing is only half of it. The other half is the labor model, and this is where the dry comedy of the operation really starts to show. An Aldi checkout operator in Australia is paid according to enterprise agreements lodged with the Fair Work Commission, meaningfully above the general retail award, often 20% to 30% above the minimum classification rate. The chain is, on a per-hour basis, one of the better-paying mass-market supermarket employers in the country, and yet its labor cost, as a percentage of sales, is lower than either Coles or Woolworths. The reason is that a single Aldi store typically operates with a staff of around 15 to 20 people across all shifts, compared to well over 100 at a full-line competitor. The checkouts are deliberately engineered for speed. Barcodes are printed on multiple sides of the packaging so the operator never has to rotate an item. Items are not bagged at the register. Pallets are wheeled directly onto the shop floor and customers pick from the cardboard, eliminating an entire layer of shelf-stocking labor. The 2020 ACCC report on supermarket competition noted, in fairly dry language, that Aldi's operating model achieved roughly equivalent customer throughput with approximately 1/3 of the labor hours per dollar of sales. Pay people more, hire fewer of them, design the job so a single person can do the work of 3. It is the kind of model that sounds obvious once described, and yet in 23 years, no Australian competitor has managed to copy it. Copying it would require dismantling the deli counter, the bakery, the florist, the magazine rack, the loyalty program, and the entire identity of a full-service supermarket. Then there is the middle aisle. Officially, Aldi calls it special buys. Unofficially, in the Australian vernacular, it is the aisle of shame, the place where a shopper goes in for milk, walks out with a chainsaw, a ski jacket, a beekeeping suit, and an inflatable kayak. It is, by any rational measure, a deeply weird thing for a supermarket to do. It is also, according to internal industry estimates cited in IBISWorld's 2023 supermarket report, responsible for roughly 20% of Aldi Australia's total revenue on less than 15% of its floor space. The special buys rotate twice a week. They are sourced through a global procurement operation that buys end-of-line manufacturing runs, factory overstock, and one-off production deals from suppliers across Europe and Asia. Because the volumes are committed years in advance and the range is curated centrally from Aldi's Australian headquarters in Minchinbury, Western Sydney, the chain captures margins on a ski jacket that a department store paying for retail floor staff and seasonal markdowns simply cannot match. The special buys do something else too. They train the customer to come in more often than they would for groceries alone and to treat every visit as a small treasure hunt. The behavioral economists have a term for this. It is called variable reward scheduling, and it is the same mechanism that makes poker machines work. Aldi did not invent it, it just applied it to gardening gloves. By the mid-2010s, the incumbents had finally noticed. Woolworths launched its Essentials private label range, then renamed it, then expanded it. then quietly conceded that its real benchmark was no longer Kohl's but the German discounter with fewer than 500 stores. Kohl's introduced its own deep private label push and rebuilt its pricing architecture around what insiders began calling, only half-jokingly, the Aldi line. The price point below which a Kohl's product had to sit if a comparable Aldi item existed within the catchment. A 2021 Reserve Bank of Australia bulletin on retail competition noted that the expansion of Aldi had been associated with a measurable compression in grocery price inflation across the 2010s, estimating that the discount channel had conservatively shaved tens of basis points off annual food CPI growth across the decade. That is a small-sounding number that compounded across a 2.5 million person economy, spending roughly $120 billion a year on groceries, translates into billions of dollars in consumer surplus that simply would not exist if Theo Albrecht's children had decided. In the late 1990s, that Australia was too far away and too small to bother with. And this is where the open loop from the start finally closes. Recall that 2020 ACCC finding the one about prices falling at Kohl's and Woolworths, even on items Aldi did not sell. The mechanism, the report explained in language so understated it almost reads as, comedy was competitive signaling. When a major incumbent knows that a hard discounter is watching its prices on the 200 most purchased staples, it cannot afford to be visibly more expensive on those items because the discounter will use that gap in its advertising. To protect the headline basket, the incumbent lowers the price of the staples, but lowering the price of staples alone would be commercially suicidal because staples are the highest frequency purchases and the ones customers remember. So the incumbent rebalances, it lowers staple prices, then quietly compresses margins across adjacent categories to maintain a coherent price image. Because a shopper who sees cheap milk and expensive cheese in the same aisle stops trusting the store. The result is a cascading price effect originating from a competitor that may stock only 1,800 items, rippling across a range of 25,000. Aldi does not need to sell the cheese to lower the price of the cheese. It just needs to sell the milk credibly enough that the cheese aisle starts to feel watched. That is the mechanism. Not lower prices, not private label, not the middle aisle. The mechanism is competitive gravity exerted by a small body with such unusual density that it bends the orbits of much larger ones around it. The story of Aldi in Australia is, in the end, not really a story about a supermarket. It is a story about how a single firm with a foreign operating model, a kidnapped survivor's obsession with cost, a refusal to play by the local rules, quietly rewired the price of a national grocery basket without ever holding a dominant market share. The chain still sits at only around 10% to 11% of Australian grocery sales by most estimates. It has never been the biggest. It has just been the most disciplined, and the same pattern, the small disciplined entrant warping a complacent duopoly, is now playing out in other corners of Australian retail and services, from hardware to pharmacy to discount department stores. The next obvious question is, what happens when Bunnings, a company with even higher market share than Kohl's, Woolworths, and even fewer credible competitors, finally meets its own version of an Aldi? There is a German hardware giant, family-owned, currently mapping Australian sites. Its name is one most Australians have never heard, yet. That German hardware giant is called Hornbach, and while its Australian plans remain officially unconfirmed, industry watchers in Frankfurt, Sydney have spent the last 3 years tracking the same kind of quiet site analysis that preceded Aldi's 2001 arrival in Stanhope Gardens. Hornbach is privately held, founded in 1877 by Michael Hornbach in the German town of Landau. Now operates more than 170 megastores across Europe, each one averaging around 11,000 square meters of retail floor. For comparison, a large Bunnings warehouse runs between 13,000 and 20,000. The footprints are similar. The pricing philosophy is not. Hornbach's slogan, roughly translated, is, "There is always something to do." Its internal pricing rule is that no competitor in its catchment should be cheaper on a tracked item for longer than 72 hours. That is a tighter window than Bunnings currently enforces on its own famous price guarantee, which promises to beat any competitor by 10% but relies on customers to actually find and present the lower price. The pattern, if it repeats, will look familiar. A handful of stores will open, probably in outer suburban growth corridors of Melbourne and Sydney, places like Cranbourne, Marsden Park, where land is cheaper and the demographic skews toward younger tradespeople and first home renovators. The range will be smaller than Bunnings, perhaps 8,000 stock keeping units against Bunnings' 45,000. The prices on tracked staples, cordless drills, exterior paint, decking screws, treated pine will be 10% to 15% below the Bunnings shelf. And Bunnings, like Kohl's and Woolworths before it, will face a choice. Match the prices everywhere and surrender margin on the 85% of its range that nobody is shopping competitively. Match only in the affected catchments and accept that price-aware customers will travel. Or refuse to match and watch a slow leak in basket size that does not show up in quarterly results for 2 or 3 years. Wesfarmers, the parent company of Bunnings, reported a Bunnings earnings before interest tax margin of around 12.5% in its most recent full year on revenue of just over $19 billion. That is roughly $2.5 billion of operating profit from a single retail banner. By contrast, Kohl's and Woolworths food divisions run on margins closer to 5%. Bunnings is, by any reasonable measure, the most profitable big box retailer in the country, possibly the most profitable hardware chain per square meter anywhere in the developed world. It has achieved this with a market share in home improvement estimated at around 50%, more than double the combined share of every other player. That kind of margin, sustained over a decade, is exactly the sort of thermal signature that attracts a disciplined foreign entrant. Aldi found a duopoly running fat. Hornbach, if it comes, will find a near monopoly running fatter. There is, of course, a counter-argument, and it deserves a hearing. Australia is not Germany. Distances are longer, population density is lower, and the cost of standing up a national logistics network is genuinely punishing. Aldi itself took nearly 15 years to reach break-even profitability in Australia. It relied on the patient capital of a family-owned structure that does not need to answer to quarterly shareholders. Costco arrived in 2009 and, more than a decade later, operates only 15 warehouses nationally. Kaufland, another German discounter, spent 4 years, reportedly $450 million, buying Australian sites before abruptly canceling its entire local rollout in January 2020, just weeks before the pandemic hit. The Australian retail graveyard is full of foreign entrants who underestimated the tyranny of distance and the stubbornness of local habit.